Hi everyone, welcome to our first interview on this site with a colleague in another field. We thought it'd be interesting to stretch out and look at what's happening in the world of COVID in a number of issues that we're not doing research on at the Open University, but colleagues are. So I'm very happy to welcome today Andy Metcalf, who's a psychoanalyst and been working as a psychoanalyst now for quite a while. He's known for his book with Andy Metcalf some 30 years ago, I think, Andy, on the city, Slump City. And he's written on relational psychoanalysis, which is his field, in the journal Attachment, Stepping into the Archipelago in 2012, which we'll link to on this site. But Andy, welcome today. I'd like to start by asking you just about, what you think the radically different experiences are that people are facing living now under this lockdown and under COVID.
Yes, thanks, Sophie. Well, I think, the diversity of experience is just want to emphasize it over and over again. I have a friend who is going to possibly collaborate with me on a video, an art video, and he just told me, oh, lockdown has been fantastic for me because I've been furloughed from my chef job, which is very onerous, very long hours. So I've got a living wage and I can devote myself to my video making and video editing and my other identity he has as an artist. So that's just somebody that told me that 2 days ago. Other people, you can imagine, with small children in tiny flats without a garden, are having a radically different experience to those of us who have houses and gardens. So there's class involved in what the subjective experience is, but also what in discussing with my colleagues, what I've come to feel about my own experience is that there may be other people like me who've had a kind of varying experience where some days feel very psychologically demanding and difficult. And that, I think, is to do with the fact that the difficulty and disturbance that is part of being human, the deep part of being human, is massaged and buffered and maneuvered out of sight by everyday routine. There's something profoundly important to us in our identity and in the way that we manage difficult feelings, difficult experiences that can occur day to day, that everyday routines, feeling fed up at our desk and deciding I'm going to walk to the cafe and have a coffee, and then seeing life go by, sitting on the street, seeing life go by, just sitting in an environment with other people in a coffee bar, is re-regulating, to use this new language that therapists use. We regulate ourselves back into a more easy stream of life. People use exercise for that, famously. People use, walking for an hour may not re-regulate you, but you can, if you run for a couple of hours, it will re-regulate you, It's got something to do with the extremity. I was doing swimming 3 times a week and going to the gym as well as yoga and Pilates. The gym and the swimming have gone and I'm struggling, because my ordinary routine was keeping me in my life. Now, nothing much has changed. I do a little bit of client work as, working relationally. And I also have I have a very full-on art practice. Nothing much has changed, but my feelings, my mood state changes day by day. And I think talking about it to colleagues, that's because lockdown has a profound effect upon, you know, what we might call all these buffered states, all these ways that we have unconsciously learned how to regulate, how to build senses of well-being into our lives. And a lot of it feels automatic, you know, it just feels like, oh, I fancy a walk now, or I'm going to go for a coffee now, or
Yeah.
I want to see, you know, I need to see friends 3 or 4 times a week, kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's interesting hearing you talk about that, Andy, because the kind of reverse side of that, which I work on, is thinking about what those spaces are like normally, you know, the everyday cultures that you're talking about, the everyday routines, how they make the spaces of the city. And at the same time as this is having effect, as it were, cyclically, it's having an effect on those spaces because they're vacated of those everyday routines. So that's the kind of mirror image, if you like, of the kinds of things that I'm interested in when I'm thinking about public space, for example.
Yes.
So I mean, it's fascinating to hear what that might mean internally, as it were. You're talking about this.
The relational point is,
Yeah.
sort of goes back to this very core thinker in relational psychoanalysis, Stephen Mitchell, sadly not with us anymore, who wrote a book called Hope and Dread in Psychoanalysis, where he deals with the fact that we have an identity which can be described in 2 ways, which appear contradictory but actually aren't contradictory. One is the famous Winnicottian identity of sort of the authentic self, which means that you do feel a continuity, unless you're in a very disturbed state. If you're not in a very disturbed state, you'll feel a historic continuity with the you that was a little boy, for me, that went to boarding school, that escaped from my family, etc., that went into political ways of thinking. That's a historical continuity. But what Stephen Mitchell then also says, but it's also true that actually there is an identity which shapes itself moment to moment in relational contexts. It won't shape itself like that if the person you're with or the people you are with refuse that relational matrix. If they're refusing self-disclosure, or if they're refusing to be meaningful in any way, then the relational matrix isn't there. So it's a very, very different way of thinking about the therapeutic encounter, but also thinking about the site, you know, about what identity is. And that's why when you get lockdown, you get this complete change in the relational matrices.
What do you think that says then, that question of those relational matrices, when all of the relations that people are having are now, well, particularly for people living on their own at the moment, most of the relations they're having are online through this kind of form of relation. What do you think that's doing to the sense of internal space?
I think just the thing about the power of historic patterns in people, which is when I speak to my friends who've lived on their own for many, many years, they are not disturbed. Largely, they are not disturbed by lockdown. They have accumulated all sorts of ways of being solitary and have made an adaptation. And if they made a good adaptation, they quite like it.
That's interesting.
You know, but other people are having a really, really tough time psychologically, probably full of feelings of despair and futility and maybe mortality, impending mortality, from having their kind of relational matrices stripped out, you know, if they suddenly find themselves on their own. And I do know that from talking to people that is going on. And I think what screen-based connection is it's something, but it's also really not very much. It's both, it's a chimera, it's, you know, we are having a real conversation, Sophie. You are really there. There's something real in it, but at the same time, we can't have a hug, or we can't touch hands or anything, or we can't really know what our body language is saying. We can't really inhabit the space together. You know, we're not in the same space.
No, I agree. I mean, I found that Zoom conversations have got less satisfying. I've got better at them in the sense at the Open University, we do all of our work online, and some days I'm on for 5 or 6 hours. Yeah. So I know how to do it, but it's extremely unsatisfying, I would say. Not extremely unsatisfying, but often unsatisfying.
Yeah, and demanding.
It's incredibly demanding.
Because our voices are louder. We're like trying to bridge, we're trying to get through cyberspace to the other person. You know, we're speaking emphatically. Yes, exactly. I'm speaking louder and more emphatically than I would if I was sitting with you, you know. Right. And I think there's a tendency to kind of crudify thought, because, it's almost like, to get across the digital barrier, I need to say something very loud and very simply and probably slightly crudely. There's that. It's influencing the subtlety that's possible, I think. Yeah.
I completely understand what you're saying here. So let's move on then to this question about depth therapy, which you mentioned. You know, how does it offer something to a person in these times?
Well, it's just like what I and my colleagues in Free Psychotherapy Network offer is, we don't offer time limited. We offer some idea that we offer a process which really seems to work for kind of depth change, as long as you give it enough time, so that it's not time limited. There's no contract that's time limited, and it's sort of, and it's under review fairly frequently. Where are we going? Is it of value? Do you think this is of value? Do you feel just dependent upon it? All those kinds of review questions need to be touched upon, because psychoanalysis, for good reasons, has developed a reputation of developing dependency in its clients and then sort of never letting them go. Or if it lets them go, there are lots of very bad endings. Traditional, what Stephen Mitchell called classical psychoanalysis, rather than what we do, which is contemporary. Classical psychoanalysis also has a great problem with knowing how to end, which means knowing how to accept that this has been valuable, but maybe it's now time to move on, and that you can't have a complete, human beings aren't like that. You can't be completely analysed. Oh, now I no longer have disturbance in me. I've done 12 years on the couch. That's not true. That has no truth in it.
Yeah.
Human beings carry on being disturbed by their own life history, their own narrative of their life, but also through what happens to them in society. So there's a dialectical relationship with society. This is another thing that classical psychoanalysis hasn't got. It's sort of become bourgeois in that way, in which it sort of believes that all these questions have nothing to do with society.
It's interesting. I mean, I've got friends who are psychotherapists who've told me that in some ways, dealing with people on the phone or on Skype, or which I don't know which ways you use, but they've said that some of the intensities have come out more strongly in that medium than, as it were, on the couch. What do you think about that?
I think there's a diversity of experience. I feel like my work on Zoom with my clients is not noticeably less effective. Mm. But I do think the contact is unsatisfactory. But I don't think, now I can imagine, depending on your style of work, that it could, there could be it could become more intense on Zoom. I can imagine that, but it's just not my experience. I just don't think there's not standards in that way. This is the whole problem. When you read some classical psychoanalysis talking about, as in the Herretz piece, when they talk about it, they are almost talking as if they're in church.
Really?
Delivering the lesson. Yeah, because what they're saying is, well, the Herretz piece says that there are cycles of destruction and creativity in nature and in human life. Nothing about society coming in there. There's no societal impact on that. Although Freud wrote his piece on the death instinct right after the First World War, in which he lost his sons in combat, which he never spoke about or wrote about.
So does he not write about it even when he's writing about the death instinct?
He does not, no. It's really shocking.
Yeah.
That he doesn't access his subjectivity in that way at all.
Mm.
So that's another way that relational work changes things, where you accept that there are two subjectivities in the room. There are two subjectivities, and the question is what's going on between them, whereas in classical psychoanalysis, there's one subjectivity, and the question is, what are you doing to the therapist?
Right.
What are you, the patient, doing to me?
Yeah.
And I say it like that because it's largely thought of. You're doing something nasty to me, and the point is to analyse that.
So going back to some of the things you talked about in the beginning, you said that this kind of disorientation that people might be experiencing, or the absence of usual self and so on, is pushing people up perhaps against a life history they didn't even know they had, or they hadn't much experience of. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about myself in that at the beginning of lockdown, in my household, there were questions about where in which house my stepkids were going to be living, with us or with their father or somewhere else. And I don't think I was able in time to realize that actually I felt really terrified about this discussion, because of my age. It was threatening, but I didn't realize I had a subjectivity, which was actually, I feel really, I feel like there is a terror of this contagion. I wasn't able to access that knowledge of myself. So I think, the discussions we would have had would have been different, would have been probably less difficult if I could have accessed the fact that it was frightening. These choices that were opening up felt inherently frightening because they were opening up channels of contagion. That was true. So it was something about me not being willing to recognize that there was a me inside of me that was capable of being terrified. And that there was something, I was not able to access that. And I think if you're not able to access it, then you're in a disturbed state. If you can name it, if you can discuss it, if you can name your fear and discuss it, suddenly it's less gripping. It's less dominating.
And that's where relational psychoanalysis comes in some sense.
Yes, but also if, that's how we want to change the culture. We want to change the culture that feelings or self-states, as we would call them, self-states can be discussed as part of life, not as questions of mental health. They're not questions of mental health. A dubious category, mental health. They're not questions of mental health. They're not questions of disturbance, levels of disturbance, which I would accept as a useful term. They are just part of what goes on. you know, and and sharing them is a part of intimacy. What deep friendship is about, or relationality is about, and it opens up relational channels, and that is deeply kind of healing and deeply, it takes people out of a kind of inaccessible introspection, being locked down inside yourself. I'm trying to do this in my hand, and takes you into a space where you can communicate with others.
But how do you think people can do that under lockdown? I mean, getting back to what we were saying earlier.
Well, difficult, isn't it? Because I think it's not possible necessarily to do that inside the nuclear family entirely. I think that's often what really good friendship is about.
I mean, I think that's fascinating.
About, you know, the nuclear family that needs it, everything needs to be stable, you know.
Yeah, kept on the road, as it were.
Kept on the road, exactly. Very good phrase. Yeah, yeah. And for good reason. Also, there's, you know, one could agree with that. There's good reason for that. It's not like, but so, you know, friendship. Then, you know, I think we are moving into this new world. You know, there's a potentiality for richer friendships because there's much more diversity in how people are living.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
People living on their own, you know. Such
So
I
mean, sort of finally moving towards some winding up here. I mean, how do you see things unfolding? Because I would have thought one of the problems at the moment, and I don't know how this relates to your thinking about relational psychology, but psychotherapy, but is the sense that nobody quite knows what the future is going to be. There's a real sense, I think we've moved from, you know, initial shock. I don't know if you would describe it as shock, but I think a lot of people went through shock and then, you know, certain accommodations. And now there's a sense of uncertainty and this is going to go on forever. How do you think that plays into all this?
Well, I think there is an opportunity for wide ranges of people to think about social space, not, you know, not just in terms of shopping. I mean, going into my local shopping area, Crouch End, there's something very poignant. It almost feels like people are walking up and down the streets because this is the only way they know about how to be in society, you know, and we need to have other places which aren't in that commercial nexus, because lots and lots of those units in the high street are never going to open again. They were operating before the pandemic on tiny margins. Lots of people run shops on basically, you know, the living wage. That's all they get out of it. Lots of little ventures are like that. People are not making great deals of money on the high street anymore. The chains, owners of chains maybe, but so, you know, how many coffee shops will there be? You know, left? Maybe there will be, but I think the diversity and richness of all that is going to not come back, and therefore we need to think about non-commercial spaces where people can promenade, you know, do what the Italians do, you know, promenade, sit around, but not necessarily spend, not necessarily consume, or do very modest consumption, you know.
Andy, I find that really fascinating because it brings us back to some of the social science questions that some of us are working with at the Open University. Yes. The sort of spatial questions that geographers are thinking about, and the sort of socio-spatial questions that people like me in sociology are thinking about. So it seems to me that there could be a really interesting sort of synergy between people like yourself working in psychoanalysis and thinking about relational questions in relation to the individual and identity and so on, and trying to bring that together with thinking about how that maybe operates in material spaces, like you're saying, new kinds of ways of being in the public, new ways of making space. And perhaps that is a positive, kind of optimistic way of thinking about how we might come out of this with something a little bit better, perhaps.
Yeah.
To sort of conclude and say something on that, and then we'll wind up our interview.
Yes. I mean, I'm saying all the same things, which is our deep down sense of who we are and our identity is in part, only in part, but in part societal, relational, and relational in really subtle ways, whereby, you know, you wave at somebody, or your eye catches somebody who you don't even know their name, but you know that sometimes they go to the same shop as you, or you know, they're picking up your rubbish, or they're on the bus route, you know. And that we live in this matrix that's much richer. And that's what lockdown shows us.
Yeah.
It's a much richer matrix than when we were in the neoliberal world of rush, 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 rush. Who the fuck are you anyway? I haven't got time to even acknowledge that you're sitting there, and I'm going to speak very loudly on this bus because I get a buzz out of speaking very loudly into my phone about work matters on this bus. All that stuff has gone, but we can appreciate, I think, that we need a much bigger, not just 3 best friends, not just 7 best friends, but we need this variety. And then when people are kind of wandering around shopping areas, they are poignantly, I think, evoking the fact that they're looking for something.
Yeah.
And in therapy, we know something about, as relational therapists, we know something about looking for something.
Yeah.
And allowing something to blossom, allowing something to come up into consciousness.
That's great, Andy. So I'd like to thank you for this interview. And Andy Metcalf has, as I said, written various things that you would find interesting. We'll link the site to the interview to these articles. But I'd like to thank Andy Metcalf again for sharing his time with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for doing the discussion with me. We've done it together.
Thanks.
It's been relational.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.